The Adulting with ADHD podcast is not a substitute for medical advice. Please see a medical professional if you think you have ADHD or have ADHD and need additional assistance. For podcast archives, please visit patreon.com/adultingwithadhd. This is the Adulting with ADHD podcast, self-empowerment for people with ADHD. Today I'm excited to have with me Joe Nucci, a psychotherapist and author of the upcoming book Psychobabble. A fellow ADHDer, he made a name for himself on Instagram and TikTok addressing misinformation and calling out the misuse of mental health jargon. Welcome to the show, Joe.
Hey, Sarah. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start by you telling us a little bit about yourself and what led you to write Psychobabble.
Sure. I have been practicing in some capacity. Gosh, how long has it been? We're approaching a decade now. I think it's been about like 7 or 8 years. I started posting on social media a little over 2 years ago. It was honestly on a whim. It was like I had some people encouraging me to do it. I saw that seemed to be where the economy was going and where a lot of marketing was going. So in my head, I was like, maybe I'll just do this and I'll advertise for my practice for it. But I had no idea that I would end up taking it so seriously, because my 14th video ever got like 1 million views on Instagram. And I was just like, wait, what? It's funny how quickly things can shift for us, right? Because before that, people were like, why don't you make content so people in my life? And I was like, dude, because cringe. I was like, because I never want to do that. And then you get some positive reinforcement and you're like, oh, I'll do it. I'm not cringing. And so as I started to take it more seriously, I started to look at self-help content and mental health content more seriously. And as you and whoever's listening is probably familiar, this wasn't such an open conversation even like 5 years ago. It was really, I think, a lot of things, but primarily the pandemic forced a lot of us to slow down, to turn inward, and just to acknowledge that mental health is a thing. It needs to be talked about for so many different reasons. It's so important. And as I was just exploring, like, how are people talking about this, I started to encounter what I felt was a lot of people talking about it either A, incorrectly, spreading misinformation, or messaging the information in a way that lacked nuance that I believed was problematic. And what I like to remind people is I'm not this ivory tower finger wagging like therapist. Well, like, I have a license, so only I get to say what these words mean and how to use them. My biggest concern is that oftentimes we're using these terms to pathologize or medicalize everyday life, or to use the tools of mental health to understand something that I don't think that the tools are well suited for. And so it's not just a matter of semantics. I think it also has real consequences for people and how they navigate their lives and how they navigate their therapy journey.
Absolutely. Can you walk us through a common ADHD myth that you're seeing when you're out and about?
Sure. It seems like just yesterday, doesn't it, that I was watching documentaries on YouTube or on TV, and it was saying like, this is so overdiagnosed and we need to stop diagnosing all of our children with it. And then I don't quite know when the switch happened, but now it's like everybody has it. Everybody's neurodivergent. Like, everybody should have an Adderall prescription. And so I'm not totally sure where or why the switch happened. There's probably more than one reason, but one of the biggest myths I see about ADHD, and it's one that I write about in my book, is that it is this idea that this is the only reason why you have focus problems, when really there's actually, if you go see any therapist worth their salt, they're going to assess you for disordered sleep. They'll probably want you to get blood work done. And that's not just for hormones and stuff like that, but also like nutritional deficiencies, right? Are you nourishing yourself okay? And I know that for me, as someone with ADHD, taking care of my body, like taking care of my vessel, is the number one way I keep my symptoms under control. Now, we're not going to get a perfect night's sleep every night. We can't always eat everything with the ingredients that agree with our systems. And so that's why I use medication, because it is part of my neurodevelopmental style or condition, however you want to think about it. But that, I think, does squarely put it in the category of a mental illness or neurodivergency, if you don't prefer that language, is because for me that there is something different in my wiring, but how severe that is does go up and down. Now, even if you don't have my wiring, right? If you're low on sleep, you're not going to be able to focus very well. If you have impulsivity things, maybe those get a little bit worse, right? Or whatever it is. And so I think for me, that's the biggest thing. I just want people to be a little bit more curious. And listen, if you do have ADHD and you have to fight for your diagnosis in order to get the proper treatment, I think that's awesome. But what I often see is a lot of people claiming the label or claiming, oh, I have a little bit of it, I have a sprinkle of it, but then they're not actually taking it a step further. They're not taking any sort of responsibility or steps so they can actually function better. I'll tell you, Sarah, my team, and I work with a team that edits a lot of my videos. And I remember when I first decided to make videos about having ADHD and being open about that on my platform, I was like, they were all surprised. They were like, do you actually? And I was just like, yeah. I was like, oh my gosh. And then it inspired so much content. But I share that not as a humble brag or anything like that, but really just to let people know that it's, if you actually get the help, like it's not going to be something that's part of your identity or personality necessarily.
If you're listening to this show, you get how stress and overwhelm can wreak havoc on your life, and how sometimes the issue runs deeper than that. That's where ADHD Online comes in. They offer a thorough, clinically backed assessment that not only checks for ADHD, but also screens for anxiety, depression, and more. To save $40 and to get on the path to relief now, visit ADHDonline/adulting with ADHD and use promo code adultingADHD40. But yeah, I'm really glad that we're having a nuanced conversation about this, because I, as someone who puts information out there, it's difficult sometimes. What do you have to say to people who you mentioned earlier, like who are having difficulty accessing a diagnosis? So why is mental health information problematic when you're getting it online? Is it always problematic?
That's a good question. I think there's a cogent argument to be made that mental health information is always problematic just because the field is so new. People forget that there are people alive today who were alive during Freud's time. It's brand spanking new.
Yeah.
And because of that, there are things that we really sincerely believed just a few short decades ago that seem laughable today. So, one example of this
Yeah.
is the Veteran Affairs Association took the idea of PTSD and laughed it off as a quacky, just like ridiculous statement. And now trauma is something else I write about in my book, right? And like how it's so can be overused and misapplied and all this stuff. And so I think that like any field, like medicine, like policy, nutrition and fitness science, we're always going to be evolving and growing. So no matter where you're getting the information, whether it's from a journal or whether it's a social media post, yeah, be a little skeptical, be a little curious. I think that's number one. I think number two, I think social media makes it particularly viral because that's where the heartbeat of popular culture is these days, whether people like to admit it or not. I know I spend more time scrolling than is probably good for me. Speaking of having ADHD, that hyper focus can be a real killer. Where I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And I think that it's also the way you compete. And I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. It's just part of making content. I do this too. You want to deliver it in a strategic or a sensationalized way that's going to grab attention. And
Right.
it is, and I'm not even totally sure where the line is because I think it's on a case by case basis. Where does that hook or whatever it is, at what point does that cross over into ethical gray area or an area where maybe the information is getting miscommunicated? I think it's different for absolutely everyone. But what I tell people is I'm like, listen, I think that the culture, mental health culture right now is like where I was when I was a first year psych student in grad school, where you're just really excited and all these things are clicking and all these light bulbs are going off. But the difference is I kept studying.
Yeah.
And even if year one in grad school, I may have been accidentally trying to give my family a little therapy or using this term in this casual conversation or whatever it is. I eventually learned how to employ these terms and concepts properly. It's a little bit like I write about this in the book too. It's a little bit like learning a new language or learning an instrument. When you first learn an instrument, you're going to be confined to these like rigid drills and chords and notes and songs. But after you develop fluency, you can riff, you can put your own spin on it. But you have to be rigid in that first stage. You have to learn how to do that. And so I would say to anyone that's listening to this, it's don't feel overly guilty that, oh, I'm contributing to this problem, this epidemic of psychobabble, because I would be disingenuous by saying that 100% of my content is messaged perfectly. Of course it's not. But it's great that we're having this conversation and that we could all just think a little bit more intentionally on how we're putting stuff out there and what to do if you put something out there and then a year later a new study comes out or there's a nuance you want to add. Like, how do you continue the conversation?
I love that. Yeah. On that note, it's a complicated, wide open question, but what do you have to say about how can patients better protect themselves from this misinformation? Like you said, the line is hard to find. And if you're an end user, how do you even know? Are there
Right.
any advice you can give us for being a
Yeah,
smarter consumer of the medium?
absolutely.
Hmm.
I think that when it comes to ADHD information specifically, I think that we want to, the word that comes to mind for me is like a balanced approach, balance. So what does that mean? It's let's have a foot like in what the literature says. There's a lot of great science about ADHD and how to treat it and how it works. And there's a lot of journals that are freely accessible online.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of pages that are dedicated to I'm going to tell you exactly what the paper says, and they're real researchers. They're not going to lean it one way or the other, right? They're going to stay true to that methodology. And I think it's okay to have your other foot, and this research is always evolving, and sometimes what the coaching community or the neurodiversity community has said about something, maybe years later it ends up being true. The rub though is I think that we want to be very cautious about making all or nothing statements or too like big blanket statements. And so just a basic example that I brought up earlier is disordered sleep. People with ADHD, myself included, can have struggles with getting to sleep on time and regularly and waking up feeling rested. And if your sleep is off for whatever reason, it can mimic ADHD symptoms. And so whenever I see a post that's this is definitely a trait of ADHD, right? I like to stop and I like to think and I like to use something called conditional logic. So anyone who has ever studied for the LSAT or ever took a class on this may be familiar with the following example. If it's a dog, it's always a mammal, right? But if it's a mammal, it's not necessarily a dog, right? If it's ADHD, you are probably distractible. But if you're distractible, it's not necessarily ADHD. It's not a two-way street. And I think that regardless of what the diagnosis or what the buzzword is, I think if you can keep that in mind, I think that'll help you sort through a lot of BS. Most definitely.
Yeah, definitely. I like that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Psychobabble, when it comes out, and where our listeners can find it.
Sure. So Psychobabble, Viral Mental Health Myths and the Truths to Set You Free is going to be available wherever books are sold. And so that can be Amazon, that can be Barnes and Noble, that can be Target, it can be local bookstores. And it's going to be out on September 23rd, 2025. You could also go to my page at Joe Nucci Therapy on any social platform or joenuccitherapy.com. And my last name is like a Gucci, but with an N as in Nancy. So that's
Nice.
Nucci, Joe Nucci
Mhm.
Therapy. And all the relevant links will be there too.
Wonderful. And your handles, if people want to follow you on social?
Yeah. Is at Joe Nucci Therapy. So
Okay.
first name, last name, Joe Nucci Therapy.
Can you tell us a little bit about your process behind making this book, especially as somebody with ADHD?
Yeah, absolutely. Like anyone with ADHD listening, it can be really exciting to start a project and to ideate it and then to even do kind of like the beginning stages of implementation on whatever the project is. But then as it becomes less novel, it becomes more difficult to sustain that focus. And so one of the things that I did is I really reorganized my schedule. So there were times where I was either like all in or all out. So the when I was working on writing it, let's see, I wrote it for the majority of 2024, the year. I was just a no to socializing during the week. It was none of this, oh, like I'll go out for dinner, I'll go out for one drink, I'll go out, whatever it might be. Now, would I take breaks? Like, of course. And that's actually something that's an executive functioning skill that if you don't know about it is very important because it's easy for us not to. But then the break we
Yeah.
end up needing to take later is so much longer, or we can really burn
Right.
ourselves out. And so, of course, like I would go on like walks or go to the gym or stuff. It's not like it was the only thing that I was doing, but I was very clear that I could not schedule things that were more enticing or more novel during this time, during the weeks, particularly. I was very good about not working on it on weekends. Maybe there was a weekend here or there if I was traveling during the week or whatever it is. I had to make a deadline, whatever that may be. And I very, very rarely drink any alcohol. I know for me, that is just a huge kind of trigger for my symptoms. I feel the next day, even after a glass, my symptoms are so much worse, even with Adderall, which I'm prescribed. And so that was something else I was very disciplined around that was very helpful. I also don't know if this is an ADHD hack per se. I don't. And maybe you would know. I haven't tried looking at like the
Hmm.
literature and stuff, but there's like a wellness spa near my place where I live in New York, and I would go and I would do the cryotherapy or the cold
Oh,
plunge.
yeah.
And when you're in that sustained cold, you get a bunch of adrenaline, a bunch of norepinephrine, and they say, and I don't know if it's wellness biohacker babble from social media, but what they
Mhm.
say is that you do have like elevated dopamine. And I know that for people with ADHD, we need a little bit of extra of that. That's why Adderall works for us like it does. Right.
Yeah.
And so I was a regular goer of that. I would go and I would be in the cold room or in the cold tub, and I would come back and I would have a few hours where I felt really just dialed in a really
Yeah.
excellent way. What are some of the other things that I did? I also did, it wasn't something I did as much, if I'm being honest, but I did do it sometimes. But other friends of mine who are entrepreneurs or other writers and stuff, we would just get on like Zoom or on a video call, like you and I are
Yeah.
on right now. And what is
Mhm.
that called again? It's a
Body
body doubling.
doubling. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
And
good
it was just
stuff.
okay, like totally. It's like in an hour, we're going to check back in. This is what I'm going to try to get done. And then we would do some rounds of that. And I thought that was absolutely amazing. And I was always very intentional too about rewarding myself, right? So whether that was just
Yeah.
taking the weekend off, or if it was like, okay, and if I finish these 4 chapters by Tuesday, like Wednesday, I get to go out. I'm a pretty social guy, I'm pretty extroverted. And so giving that up maybe wasn't always the easiest, but it was pretty like motivating,
Yeah.
if you will. And yeah, those are just some of the things that helped me complete the project. It's also, I've never really thought about this, but the book, it's 40 chapters, but the chapters are very short. Some
Mm.
of them are only 1,500 words. I think the longest is about 4,000 words. And so that was actually a great book for someone with ADHD to write, because a lot
Yeah.
of times I could pump out the first draft like in a sitting. And then I was able to incorporate my rewards or my breaks like pretty naturally. And so if there's a way to segment out your work like that, of course, that's a great executive functioning skill for anyone with ADHD.
Absolutely. Joe, thank you so much for being on the show, and I'm looking forward to this book.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much.